Okay, thank you, Vukosi, and hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. I'm just going to share my screen, and please give me like a thumbs up if you can see it. Okay.
Yep, can see it.
Thank you. So, because he has already like done an introduction of some of the things that that I do. My name is Chijioke Okorie, and so I was asked to choose my own title for my conversation or for our conversation today, and I chose data science needs law. But first, I wanted to like bring myself more into the room in terms of explaining my background and my experiences, and because they are the things that inform my thinking and my approach to some of the issues that come up with research generally, but especially data science research. So this is the Mbokiti dance group. I'm Igbo from Southeast Nigeria. And this is like an acrobatic dance of my people. I don't know how to dance it, but I know it when I see it. I went to Nnamdi Azikiwe University, got my bachelor's in law, my LLB degree, and then I went to work at CLP Legal doing commercial litigation, appearing in court because, in between getting my LLB, I was called to the bar in Nigeria as an advocate and attorney of the Supreme Court of Nigeria. So I practiced for a bit, then went to Strathclyde, University of Strathclyde in Glasgow for my master's in internet law and policy. And then I started Pen Guide. And then I went to UCT, got my doctoral degree, and I worked as a postdoctoral research fellow with the South African Research Chair in IP Innovation and Development. And then I joined the IP CAT, which is an academic blog that tries to straddle both academia and practice in terms of when it comes to intellectual property issues. So think copyright, patents, even breach of confidence issues, and then, how that intersects with technology and the digital environment. And then I came to the University of Pretoria, and then I started the Data Science Law Lab because I felt that there's a need for research that focuses on trying to address the various aspects of data science research, not strict only just from a legal perspective, but also, from an Africa perspective, because that context, I think, I believe matters a lot to how we approach things. So to start off, the complete topic is actually that data science needs law and law needs data science, because on the one hand, you have this aspect of data science, research, and practice, and all the activities that go on within that field. And if you've been part of what Vukosi and the Data Science for Societal Impact has been involved in or is doing, you would notice that this thing is something that straddles across society. So it's not just even just plain computer science. It's now the application of that to our environment, to our society, to us as those of us that are Africans, and then even to the rest of the world as well, given, that the world is a global village. So obviously data science needs law, and I will explain in a bit how and why I think so. But on the other hand, law also needs data science in terms of leveraging on the advancements and all the things that happen, in that space. So it's supposed to be a symbiotic relationship. I forget my biology, but the relationship is mutual in that they need each other. But I'm just going to focus a lot more on the first part, which is that data science needs law, because of time constraints and also because I'm feeling proud of myself to be amongst people who are in other fields that are not necessarily law or only law, I assume. So in terms of data science research in Africa, looking at the research priorities, looking at the interest. So some of the things that I've come across, and I'm sure that most of us have come across, are, work being done in terms of automatic speech recognition, machine translation, trying to have diverse and accessible text and voice data sets, crime detection, public health awareness, understanding elections and the democratic process. A lot of things. Like I said, this is something that cuts across various aspects and spheres of society. But all these things, I look at them and I think of them in the context of not just African languages specifically, but in the context of African countries, because context, I think, is everything. We would not approach things, or we should not approach things the way that other countries, other jurisdictions that don't have the same experiences as we do as people on the African continent. We can't approach things the same way. We might arrive at similar points or similar conclusions, but the process to getting there has to be something that takes cognizance of our own context as Africans or as people living or working in Africa. And having said that, the underlying factor in all of these kinds of research priorities and interest in whatever field that data science is being applied to, you would find that one unifying point is the need to have access to data, to be able to use data. So I wanted us to do like a bit of an exercise where we kind of have a conversation around the kind of data that you've used in your research. If you can be specific, it's anonymous and feel free to not join, but I wanted us to do this exercise if you can. Quickly. But while we are getting to that, it's more of trying to find out, what kind of data that you use in your research or that you use in your work. You will find that you can find your data anywhere. However, working on data that is unique to the African continent, that is unique to specific African countries, you tend to now start finding that it's not as straightforward as you would have it. For one thing, if you're working, let's say, specifically on African languages particularly, you will find that research has shown that this is not something that is, let me say, something that is that easily accessible, at least when compared to, let's say, the more high resource languages like English or French or even, is it Chinese now, or other languages. But there's that. You would also find that some of the questions that I'm asking is, where did you get your data from? Some, have access to like social media data, get data from Facebook, or even, get data from various places. Sometimes you have to pay, sometimes you don't have to pay, sometimes it's a quid pro quo kind of exercise. But having that thought around where and how you find access to data that you use in your research, especially in data science related research. I wanted to now talk about the nature of the application of law to data science research so that we can begin to see some of the thoughts that go into trying to access data, and so that we can now start looking at or try to start seeing the pain points, the places where law is maybe posing a barrier for people who want to do data science research in Africa, and where data can be a tool for growth, for better things to happen, and things like that. So the first thing is so copyright law. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty of all the aspects of law, because whilst I find it exciting, you might not find it exciting or as exciting as I do. But in terms of copyright law, this is basically a field of law that gives what I would call a bundle of exclusive rights to authors and owners of protectable subject matter, and gives them those exclusive rights to use the work that they have created. You will find things like books, articles in journals, in newspapers, online, hard copy, movies, sound recordings, so audio files, broadcasts that you would find on television, radio broadcasts as well. All those sort of things that we find in everyday life are things that could be subject of copyright protection. So imagine now that you, as a data science researcher or as a researcher, you want to use something that you want to access data that is contained in a journal article, contained in a radio broadcast, or you want to use movies or TV programs and things like that in the course of your research, you could have to deal with copyright protection. And because of the fact that copyright protects works exclusively, in that it grants this bundle of exclusive rights, which would include the right to reproduce the work. So when you are photocopying the work, downloading the work, streaming it online, even doing your copy and paste, uploading, downloading, things like that, you would be engaging in maybe the right of reproduction or the right of adaptation and things like that. And these are rights that are exclusively reserved for the copyright owner. The fact that those rights are exclusively reserved for the copyright owner means that if you're going to do anything that involves those rights, you are going to need to obtain a license from the copyright owner. Otherwise, you'll be infringing. So imagine how in the field of data science, where you don't need access to 1 or 2 or 100 of these kinds of works that are subject of copyright protection. Instead, you would want to have access to millions and millions of them as you can lay hold on, so that you can so that your training data, for example, can be worth it, and you can be able to do a lot of things, create your models and things like that. So you then need to obtain access from each and every of the copyright owner involved in all those works. So think about that. Then there's data protection law that deals with personal data. So data that identifies or that can make it easy for someone to identify a living person. So information about somebody's name, somebody's age, somebody's race, things like that in relation to that person would be personal information. And you have the data protection laws that tells you how in what circumstances and how you can use personal data or data that identifies a living person. In South Africa, you have the POPIA, the Protection of Personal Information Act, and you have to abide by the rules in that piece of legislation if you're going to use personal data. And then there's the constitutional law aspect of things, where you're dealing with privacy rights, where you are dealing with freedom of expression, freedom from discrimination. So think about things like bias and how to mitigate bias in data science research, in research that involves all these emerging technologies. Think about contract law and other proprietary mechanisms. So when it comes to contract law, a good example is your terms of use. So you go to a website, it has, their terms of use. You're using X. You're using X, and you have to abide by their terms of service, community guidelines, all these privacy policies, notices, things like that. The same thing with all, so many websites that you go to. There's that, let's say it's a unilateral contract because nobody asked you to make your own input or to review the terms of use to say, I don't like this or I don't like that. You have to accept before you continue to use that service, that platform, or even if you don't have a mechanism to actually accept, it will tell you that your continued use of this website or this platform means that you agree to these terms of use, you agree to these community guidelines, policies, privacy policies, things like that. So all these are like various aspects of law that affect your use of data depending on the kind of data you use. So think about now not knowing which specific law applies to the kind of data that you're using in your work. Think about whether a situation where you even actually know which laws apply, but you don't know whether in your specific instance, whether there are like exceptions or limitations that allow you to do certain things with the data, even though primarily like the overarching rule is that you should actually get permission, or that you can't use this data, or that you can't access that. So without now knowing how each of these fields of law apply, you start to see where the problems can come up in what you do. And that's part of the reason why we started to think about, and we actually went on to establish, like a research lab where we want to delve into these issues, where we want to meet people that are working, researchers that are working with data, and try to see how to address some of the problems and some of the barriers that they face, especially those that are working from an African perspective. And I will get into a bit of that background of how our context as people in Africa also factors in the way that you try to apply or implement these laws. So a bit of talking about the pain points now. I had like a collection of short stories. So, but first I have a disclaimer, which is that these stories are based on actual events, but I've, changed certain things for dramatic purposes. So now I'm like a filmmaker, maybe. But the first one is, I've titled it, Remove Inciting Content, but Respect the Right to Freedom of Expression. So this was something that happened with people who were working. So you had a lawyer, an attorney who was working with a social media platform and, working with the data science team in the same social media platform company. And then this attorney says to the data science team, make sure that you have a system, the system that we have in place, the way that we've designed this platform for people to use, it has to strike the right balance between the need to remove inciting content and freedom of speech. If you're a data science researcher, what would you consider, what is inciting content? What are the parameters of the right to freedom of expression? You may or may not know. You may think you know, but you might not be getting it right. But in this particular instance, the data science team, said, oh, we've set up, with the way we've set up things, our algorithm managed to remove 90% of the inciting content, and only 20% of the removed content is non-inciting and all that. But the attorney now starts to go through things and then finds that in some cases, some contents that were not even inciting were removed. So she's like, no, this algorithm is not working. You can see, this content has zero likelihood to be inciting. Why would it be removed? What kind of balance are you actually striking in terms of, removing inciting content, but you want to respect people's rights to freedom of expression? What exactly are you doing? And then he says, okay, the team leader says, oh, okay, can we decrease the percentage of removable, non-inciting content? And, the lawyer says, yes, you can do that. And then they try to tweak things, but there's like frustration going on because they tweak this and then the presence of inciting content goes up, and they are respecting people's right to freedom of expression. They tweak that, and, it's just going all over place. Why? Because the understanding of both sides differ as to what is inciting content, because that factors into your decision as, say, a data science researcher. It factors into your decision in terms of how you label your data, what you do in the course of training your model, and things like that. And so there's need for that understanding of what are the parameters of what the law requires you to do, or what informs the law, because there is no piece of legislation that can cater to every and anything that happens in life. And that's the beauty of, let me say, the beauty of life. But you need to be able to have the law be interpreted, be implemented in line with the circumstances around our environment, around our context. So there's this, story one. The second one is the one that have to do with people who were doing research on housing policy, and wanting to show how housing policy can benefit from data that they got from Airbnb. So which would involve like data scraping of data from Airbnb platform, and using that to see the decisions that people are making in terms of, where they go to, which areas they book Airbnb accommodations from, what informs their decision, when they leave reviews on the Airbnb site, how that factors into how some locations get shown the more, things like that. So this one involved data scraping. And obviously, if you go to look at the terms of use of Airbnb, there might be provisions or stipulations that forbid people from accessing Airbnb data. And also remember that people's names are there. So you're thinking personal information, maybe you would have to comply with one data protection law or the other, depending on the jurisdiction. The other one is a scenario where a government agency says you can scrape our website for your training data, you can do that for free. But when you're done with training training your model, we are going to have to co-own the model together. And then you're thinking, but you are a public body. This is your work as government. Why should we put in all this work, labeling this data, training this model, coming up with this model, and now we have to co-own with you? Why? These are also like areas where the law plays a part, because this government agency wants to co-own copyright or other intellectual property rights in the model with the researchers, and there are issues around that because, again, you think of the fact that in South Africa, at least, there's the intellectual property rights from publicly funded research, the statute that deals with that, and it has provisions as to when you can co-own or when you can co-own in certain situations. Then the other one had to do with research that was being done on the COVID-19 pandemic, and where you are looking for like the press release from the Minister of Health in any given country, and you want to be able to use that to provide data and information to the public about the preparedness of the healthcare system for, breakouts during the pandemic, or from, things flaring up, or number of infections growing, and things like that. And then maybe the press release is in a form that you would need to do a lot of things before you can use that data, or you can perform research on that data. There's that aspect. And then there's the aspect of where you are trying to access the data, which is already available to the public, but in bite size, but you now want to make sense of all that information through data science research. And there are worries around what happens when people misuse that data, misrepresent that data, who is going to take responsibility for it. And finally, you have what is called like the FAIR principles of data that so many different countries, let me not say so many, but different countries, including South Africa, Kenya, I think Ghana as well, and some other countries have subscribed to, where you want data to be findable, to be accessible, to be reusable, things like that. And then you have sometimes a situation where you get funding for your research, but the requirement is that you release the outcome of that research using a non-restrictive license. For example, the Creative Commons Zero, the CC0 license, which is basically going back to what we said about copyright, where people are saying, if there's any copyright in this research outcome, in these data sets that we've created, we release and we waive that copyright. We release this work into the public domain. Anyone and anybody can use it without needing to come back to us. And there are let me say, implications arising from that decision. Because how about instances where you then release these data sets to the public, and you have commercial entities outside the continent, I'm speaking in terms of Africa now, outside the continent, use that data because it's available to everyone, but they have more resources than you would find in the continent. And they use that data to then create commercial tools that come back to the continent and is being sold. And sometimes people in the everyday, or the average person within the continent, is unable to actually financially access these data. So, having shared this story, I wanted to also do another short survey where I'm asking which of these stories resonates with your experience as a researcher, and is it the one about trying to balance the removal of inciting content, but also trying to respect the right to freedom of expression? Is it the one with the housing policy? Is it the one where you are allowed to scrape training data for free, but you now have to grapple with ownership and control demands and things like that? Or is it none of the above? I hope not. But I want us to quickly do this exercise, and then I'm going to talk about some of the ways that I think we can resolve the pain points that I have identified. Okay, so in terms of resolving the pain points, the first one is that there are what I call copyright-less data, and you can use them. So within copyright law, for example, you have what is called, or what are called, statutory limitations and exceptions. And if what you're doing falls within the statutory limitations and exceptions, you are able to avoid copyright infringement liability, and you can still use that data. So say, for example, using South Africa as our focal point, within South African Copyright Act, you have the exception called the fair dealing exception. So if you are dealing fairly with a copyright protected work, and you're using that in the circumstance of, or in a situation of research, in a situation of criticism or review, or in a situation of personal or private use, then you would not be infringing. The challenge that most people have is being able to figure out whether, you know, what you're doing in that kind of instance is going to be considered fair. So even if you're doing research, would the circumstances of your use still be considered fair? In some cases, the courts have come up with what we call fairness factors that the court would use to assess whether, you know, in these circumstances, even though you're using it for research, even though you're making criticism or review, that it's still considered fair. What in most instances, let me not say all, because never say never, but in most instances, you would find that using copyright protected work for research would amount to fair dealing. Even if it doesn't amount to fair dealing, it's likely that it would, but even if it doesn't, you would find that it could be for when you're using it for to critique something. So you're not using it, you know, like maybe for business, or using it in a way that it was actually intended. Instead, you are engaging with the work, you're criticizing it. Even, you know, like as researchers, when you cite a given work, you quote from a written research output, and then, you know, you reference your quotes, because when you're using it for criticism or review or quotation, you have to acknowledge the source, you have to attribute the author, especially if you know them. In this instance, that's for, you know, limitations and exceptions. But you also have instances where the law says that because of the source of this particular work, we will not ascribe copyright protection to it. So, for example, there's no copyright in judicial decisions, in judgments of courts, in texts of an administrative nature, you know, text emanating from government. So our statutes, you know, our laws, the Constitution, the Copyright Act, this act, that act, and so on and so forth, they are not subject of copyright protection, so you can use them. So now imagine in a place, in a country like South Africa, where you have several official languages. If you had legislation in all the languages that we have in South Africa, for example, you will find that if you wanted training data in a given, let's say in Zulu, for example, you would be able to at least start with legislations that have been published in Zulu, because they are not subject of copyright protection. And these are ways that governments can lead by example in terms of actually educating the public, creating that awareness that when it comes to documents that emanate from government, they are not copyright protected, and people, you know, citizens, researchers, and, you know, people alike should be able to use them, you know, for the betterment of society. And I've already talked about statutory limitations and exceptions. And I think that having understood that there are various ways, you know, there are various angles, avenues where these pain points can come from, it's now, you know, leads me to suggest that it will be important to commission legal taxonomy of data, research opinions, where you are actually presenting to, people like researchers that work within data science law lab to say, this is the data that I am going to assess or I'm going to need for this particular research task or research activity. Can you explain, which laws we have to grapple with in terms of having access to these kinds of data? And context is king because, like I said, it may not help to say, that you have just the one regulation or the one piece of law that deals with everything that has to do with data, because, the context differs. It could be copyrights today, it could be personal data tomorrow, it could be, and when it comes to personal data alone, you're thinking, in some instances, health-related information that can be tied to race, that can be tied to gender, things like that, to be able to come up with revolutionary pharmaceutical products that help people that are dealing with various illnesses or disease. So that context, the local context of use, would always matter. It would always affect how you think about the way that you want to implement the law, the way that you want to interpret the law, whether you decide that new laws should be made or that existing laws should be reformed or tweaked, and things like that. And then you have things like disclaimers, seals, labels. And what do I mean by that? You want to be able to also, while you are allowing people to have access to this data, sometimes the problem might be just something that can be resolved by you putting disclaimers, attaching disclaimers to your to releasing your data set, and being able to couch the disclaimers in such a way that you don't have liability for what you should not have liability for, and people would have more information about the foundation and the source of the training data that you use to create or to develop a particular model or something like that. And work with Data Science Law Lab as a research group ourselves. We are all like in the same space, so it's easier to get informed, research-informed opinions about some of your data uses, especially when, as you can see from what I've said so far, hopefully that there are various ways that the provisions of laws and regulations and legal protection frameworks affect access to data, use of data, and even outputs from using data. And so how can you work with us, bring us into your work from inception, simplify what you are doing so that it's easier to receive legal support, actively support law reform and policy formulation activities, because you obviously have a part to play. Where it hurts the most in terms of accessing data, in terms of using legal protected data, even in your research posts, when you have your research outputs and things like that. So when there's a law reform that has to do with copyright, has to do with data protection, has to do with other proprietary mechanisms that are supported by various statutory frameworks, play a part and say something, at least say, provide information about where it hurts the most, be part of the engagement between academia, policymakers, and researchers. Like I said, you have lots to contribute to law and policy making, and get in touch, share your stories. And I have come to the end of my talk. So I would try and stop sharing my screen and see what we've said, and while in terms of our response to the questions I've asked in the survey, and while we take your questions. So I would want to see where you're giving the law a bombastic side eye. But thank you, and I'm happy to hear your questions and share in your comments as well.
Hey. Thank you for that. I think great presentation on this one. I think it was a real a journey within this part. I guess I can say one part I've been lucky to to work with Chijioke over over the last year or so, and then we've been really interacting and being able to talk about these types of things in a space where we can actually have a very clear conversation and try to think through these things is very important, I think, for data scientists to read the data science researchers in a very wide way to be able to speak through that. So if you have a question, you can kind of raise your hand, and then I'll acknowledge you, and then you can switch on your video if you want to, or you can just unmute and then ask your question. We'll go through that. But I think something that maybe I will kick off as a question is maybe the world in data science and AI from the technical side is changing every couple of hours. It feels like in some cases the law is trying to catch up when it comes to these things. And what has happened is that for a lot of organizations, they've just gone on ahead and just said, hey, we will just do things, break things, and then ask for forgiveness. And that became, and maybe not from an African perspective, that became a lot of what Silicon Valley does, is that, right? The law will try to patch these things later, but then by then it will be too late. An example, I think, is OpenAI for ChatGPT is going to try and have a system that allows for people who copyright holders to say that they don't want their things inside, right? But the models that they've already trained and people are using already have that content. So now saying that a future model, which is not the one that currently is running, actually is using that content seems actually we've already benefited from your content. It doesn't really matter if you now remove it within this. So how does this kind of square with some of the things that you've been talking about? And then how do we deal with this on the African continent, where obviously we don't necessarily have a single market. We have so many different countries with so many different ways that we think about these things. While people kind of get their questions ready.
Okay, thanks, because it's like in a way, it's like, isn't it like stating it has always been the case, do you get, that law always trails after technology, because technology is like moving fast, and before you conclude with reforming the law or making the law to address a particular situation with technology, more things are happening. And the law reform process always takes a while, because you need that consensus, you need that buy-in, and then it has to go through the parliamentary process, get public comments, submissions, things like that. Then it will go to the president, depending on what system is applicable to a particular country or jurisdiction. The thing is that what I have always advocated for, or what I've always said, is that we cannot, from a legal perspective, we cannot always be waiting for law reform in terms of changes to legislation to deal with some of these issues. It's that we have to use the existing laws that we have in such a way that people are aware of what they can or cannot do, even when there are all these technological advancements. So I'll give you an example. If you had a situation where the government was more proactive about providing information around how a particular piece of legislation interacts with what is found to be current developments in technology, people are more aware of what they can or cannot do, as opposed to shutting things down or trying to play the catch up that we are doing now. So what would, in a nutshell, what would work towards solving the problem from a legal perspective is to be more proactive about sharing information around existing laws and how they apply to what is happening with technology.
Thank you, Ken, for that. Jacob, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacob Okorie. I work at the Pan-African Parliament, which is an organ of the African Union dealing with the legislative matters. I have two main points. Number one, data sovereignty. How do we address this particular, like, how do we ensure that as a country, as a continent, we benefit from our data? What legal mechanisms can we use to protect that, such that whatever value is derived from the use of our data, there's a way we can be able to get that benefit, or we can also be able to first sort of limit, which is difficult, but just have it targeted at improving us as a continent. So what can we do for data sovereignty in the legal space? Number two is about regulation because, models have models that are trained on public data, and models that make decisions on people and human beings, like citizenry, for example, economic models and things like that, that actually have an impact on society. How can we regulate them to make sure that we are able to take care of any issues that might arise, like, for example, bias, so and to ensure that we don't get a situation where, especially for government and public services, they just simply come in with a model that is trained with data that we have no clue about, and then it has a direct impact on the people that in society. So how do we regulate that? How do we have that, covered in law? And lastly, is just that in the broad space of now, this is not related to my work, where we work, with the things like the CFTA, the Africa Free Continental Trade Area, coming up, and the need for a lot of this data. How are we going, as African countries, going to deal with the issue of different legislation and different regulation when it comes to issues of data? For example, South Africa has data protection laws, but I don't think a country like Mali does. So how do we navigate this landscape for countries that want to operate within the continent? Thank you.
Oh my God, Jacob, thank you for your questions. Dealing with the first one where you talked about data sovereignty, I'll share what I think. How do we ensure that as a continent, we get and take the benefit from our data, and that emanate from our own context, and things like that. Like I said, I think that there are existing legislations in place that we can harness to address some of these issues. But obviously, those legislations were made at a different time from the current experiences that we have. But are they still useful? Yes, to a large extent, or to a reasonable extent. Do they need changes? Probably, but like I said, and like even with the AFCFTA, that the legislative reform process, the lawmaking process takes time, and that's not a reason to not do it. We will do it. We should do it. We have to in a given democratic society anyway. But there's what I think will solve things, at least temporarily, and also give us some sort of wiggle room to address issues as they come, is soft law, where you have, guidelines, model laws, model contracts, model principles, that we can say we adhere to these principles in addressing some of these issues. So that's like your soft law that helps you to capture things essentially as they develop, and then things can be, you can add more things, and there's like a lot more wiggle room when you're dealing with models and principles and guidelines, and policies and things like that don't take a lot of time, or that take as much time as lawmaking, does. The second question you asked about regulation regarding models, where especially, for economic model, even climate change based model, because some of these things are not just economic, they are political, there are social elements, and you don't want to do something that, like on a continental scale, looks like it's working, but when it comes down to individual African countries, for example, it's not working as well. You want to have I think that an approach that works is a principle-based approach, where we take a look at some of the rationales and principles and foundational issues that form some of the laws that we have currently in existence. In terms of coming up with a set or a principle-based approach to how we regulate models, because what you apply to economic models, for example, cannot be the same as what you apply to, say, models that have to do with public health issues. So you have to take a principles-based approach. Beyond saying that we should take a principle-based approach, I am also mindful of the fact that some of the laws that we currently have across countries on the continent are informed by our colonial past. And so there's some sort of Western or global North context or perspectives underlying some of those laws. So we then have to, in coming up with a principle-based approach formed on those laws, we have to be mindful of that. We have to also then maybe be more in touch with our roots, be more in touch with the problems that face us, across continents and across countries on the African continent, and then use that to come up with broader principles that can fit into the various, uniqueness of the countries on the continent. But it's something that I'm also happy to keep talking about some more in terms of finding solutions. So I'm happy to talk later after.
Okay, I'm going to jump quickly on here. There's some questions. So one was looking at consent for social media data, and then and how this changes per social media platform. Yeah, that's maybe a quick one.
Consent for social media platforms.
Data, yeah, the data that comes from there.
When you go to, so for example, if you go to all the social media platforms, you will see their privacy policy, you will see terms of use, you will see all those information. Usually, like I mentioned in my presentation, you find that if you don't say yes to those terms of use, you will not, in some cases, you will not be able to access the platform. In some cases, they just say your continued use is, if you don't like these terms, better stop now. So that's your consent, in terms of using, but there are conditions tied to those tied to that consent, and it's now whether those conditions are actually legally supported, or and also if it adversely affects the kind of research that you want to do. So that's something to think about. But do you have consent? You usually have based on the terms of use, but there are conditions attached.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That came from Dr. Kim Robadi and Siani. Another question is, you talked about dataset licenses. Which license is appropriate? Because you said that you have to be careful about CC0.
You have to be careful about all licenses, not just CC0. And what I'm saying is that when it comes to licenses, these are sets of conditions for you to be able to access something that has some proprietary protection over them, right? So what I'm saying is not that there's any, I don't think that currently that the Creative Commons licensing, and I'm using Creative Commons licenses in a broad, from a broad perspective. So I don't just mean Creative Commons license, but I mean open licenses, right? Licenses that allow people to make, uses of copyright protected subject matter. So what I'm saying is that even though on the face of it, some of those licenses look, are, permissible, allow you to do many things, make it accessible, and things like that, that you have to be mindful that there are also underlying implications, especially looking at it from our own continent. So what do you want to enable? What do you not want to enable? Do you want to retain certain controls? Do you want to actually give up everything? Because when you give up everything, there are things that happen because you've given up everything. And do you want those things?
Yes, that was from Rosina, and then from Coyote. You mentioned about use of copyrighted work under fair use. What cautious steps should he take in utilization of social media platform data sets, like maybe Airbnb data for research and housing? Can he share the data within a GitHub repository? I'm guessing he's saying private repository with his collaborators.
I suppose, like, if your repository is private to your team of researchers, it hasn't gone out to the public, so we might not even know what you've done, right? However, like I said, if you're using social media data, they usually have terms of use, and you have to understand the conditions that are attached to their terms of use, and that would also affect how you release your data set, who you release it to, and the kind of disclaimers, for example, that you would need to have accompany what you do. And I think that disclaimers are a wonderful thing in terms of not just in the usual sense that we understand disclaimers where you are denying everything and you're saying, I'm not part of everything, but in terms of using it as a tool to explain, some of what you mean, how people should use what you've put out there, and how they shouldn't use it, at least so that that you're not enabling something that you didn't want to enable inadvertently or unconsciously.
Okay, and then the last question from Abby is, what are your recommendations for making AI systems more reliable and safe? He was thinking about things like he could use a public data set to create a model, but then use a differential privacy, meaning that you use private data, but you use differential privacy to then run that model on top of data that might be more sensitive on there. Would this be something that, that's easier to justify, maybe? Yeah.
I think so. I think that is something that is easier to justify. And I think that it's a very it's a very good example of a use case where you take your understanding of legal requirements or legal stipulations and build that into into the design of your model, into how you do things. That's like let's say, perfect marriage between data science and law, where you're bringing the two together in a way that is exciting to me.
Okay. Yeah, I think with that, we want to thank Chijioke for this very insightful talk today. I think there was a lot of people in today. As I did say, we do record this, so the recording will be available later today. And yeah, look forward to seeing hopefully most of you again in the next talks on there. Really have a good Friday and enjoy the weekend, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time for the third talk of this year's series. And thanks again, Chijioke, and yeah, have a good morning as well.
Bye.